Ben Wyatt joins me this afternoon. Welcome to the program and congratulations.
Thanks, Patricia, although one thing, I don't start until September.
All right, well, let's get ready for that in this interview. As Minister, you slammed the mining giant after it blasted those ancient rock shelters at Juukan Gorge in Western Australia's Pilbara region. That was in May last year, one of the most tragic things we've seen in our country. Yeah. Why are you now working with them?
During that time, Patricia, and I may have actually said it on your show as well, Rio Tinto had historically been one of the leaders in Western Australia when it came to agreement making with traditional owners and where they operate. What clearly became apparent after the blast at Juukan Gorge was that Rio had clearly over a period of years become disconnected from the Pilbara, indeed from WA more broadly. And I was very critical about that, but I also was determined and made the point then, I'll make it again now, is that it's actually in the interests of every Australian, every Western Australian, for Rio to get back to that leadership position. And the key point I'll highlight is that one of the biggest employers of Aboriginal people in the Pilbara is Rio Tinto. So I want Rio successful. It needs to be successful, not going anywhere, but we do need to recalibrate its focus back into those key relationships.
You do say that you're convinced that Rio Tinto is committed to changing its approach to cultural heritage issues. What evidence have you seen that that is actually the case?
Well, ultimately, when you saw a number of senior executives, including the senior-most executive, lose their position over this, and I've had a lot of conversations with the chair, and the chair indeed is finishing up early next year, and with the board members of Rio Tinto, as well as the new CEO. I've had a lot of conversations with them. I'm convinced that they want to get this right. But, Patricia, it's not just a matter of conversations between me and them. What you are seeing are the global capital now expecting this to get better. I saw that during my conversations with superannuation funds, representatives of investor groups. This is no longer something on the fringes of corporate responsibility. It's front and centre. And whether Rio likes it or not, but they do, they've got to get this much better than it has been over the last few years.
There have been no reforms to cultural heritage laws in the wake of the Juukan Gorge disaster. In WA or nationally. Isn't that a travesty that we were so outraged and we talked about it, but yet where's the law reform?
Patricia, it's a good point to make. I mean, I spent 4 years preparing a draft new heritage regime. Juukan actually crystallised a lot of focus on that because this is, in WA, it's a 1972 Act, it's an old regime, it's woefully inadequate. But there are at 3 different times over the last 3 decades the Parliament of WA has tried to change that regime. Failed, just hasn't been able to get that consensus. But what this has done is really force a consensus, if you like. I think now the draft legislation that's currently in debate is as close as we've got to a consensus. It's never going to be unanimous, absolutely not, but it elevates traditional owners, it elevates agreement making, and what it does do is set minimum standards upon which those agreements must be based. So I think we're nearly there, but the fact we're nearly there a year after Juukan is not bad, considering it's taken for 30 years. We haven't been able to get that consensus in WA.
You are the first Aboriginal person appointed to a major corporation board. Pilbara mines account for, 60% of RT profits. How are you going to tackle the problem of commitments to traditional owners and cultural heritage management plans? Clearly this is a big problem. Do you think they should be audited? What is your response on that? Should there be an audit?
An audit of Rio's agreements?
Yes.
Well, certainly Rio's been doing that. And you've got to remember, a lot of these agreements are confidential at the request of traditional owners, Patricia, because they have negotiated a lot of these agreements, not just with Rio, but with all the mining organisations in the Pilbara, with the native title rights that they have. And they want to be confidential in what they contain. That's certainly within the rights of those traditional owner groups. So audits can take place, but usually at one end. I suspect a government audit would be severely resisted by a range of traditional owner groups. So, but what it is that, look, what's a modern miner, Patricia? A modern miner now has to get this right. And I think because by and large, most big responsible miners do get this right, where the relationships with traditional owners actually work really well, and generate employment and wealth for those particular groups.
What's your view and response to that parliamentary inquiry report, Never Again, and its recommendations?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting report. I mean, there's some points I probably wouldn't agree with. I think heritage is a space for state governments, and I think it should be managed at the state government level. I mean, the Commonwealth does have a capacity to intervene if needs be, but that's rare and quite rightly so. But I think now the Commonwealth can be satisfied, particularly if that draft legislation makes its way through the state parliament, that WA, in fact, if it does, WA have, I think, the world-leading heritage regime if they can get that through the parliament, and I suspect that they will.
Okay, you say it should be a state and territory issue, cultural heritage, but with respect, WA messed it up. It happened under your watch, right?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the Section 18 approval for this occurred back in 2013, but it's important to note that occurred in consultation with the traditional owner group, with those people who are, quite rightly very aggrieved with what happened. So the regime itself was followed. The regime is inadequate. And for whatever reason, for 30 years, that consensus hasn't been achieved. I think we're there. I don't think, looking at what I've seen, to be honest, the Commonwealth government, in the way it intervenes in different areas, has the capacity to do this in any particular efficient way or effective way. But
what do you think are the flaws with the Commonwealth government getting involved? Because to me, it seems to me like having that extra layer of checks and balances when clearly Aboriginal heritage is not being respected in this country, it seems like it would be a logical thing to do.
There are 2 points to that. Firstly, the checks and balances there, as I said, the Commonwealth can intervene if it wants to. If it feels as though that state regime is inadequate or not considering issues, relevant issues. And it also is involved, of course, in things like World Heritage listing, and Murrujuk is a good example of that. But in respect of Western Australia, where a lot of these agreements are based around state agreements that miners have with the state government, it's the state government that has the capacity, has the bureaucratic infrastructure to do this much better than the Commonwealth does. Indigenous
leaders say Rio Tinto has not done enough to protect cultural heritage, and you've previously said Rio Tinto was fearful of engaging with the communities in the region. How does Rio overcome that?
Yeah, and that became apparent to me in the weeks after Jukan, is that when I reached out to the traditional owners, not just the PKKP but others, clearly Rio, in light of that international outrage, had gotten into the trench to a certain extent, a bit concerned. How do they reach out to Aboriginal groups? It's not easy. So it was clear that they had become fearful in that engagement. I think that is going to be a work in progress, Patricia, but Rio have shown, I think they know they have to get it right for their own corporate standards, but also that's what their shareholders are saying to them. So I think I can have a role in that. I want to be a standard non-executive director, Patricia, and all the responsibilities and interests that come with that. But I think now, for the first time in some time, Patricia, there is a Perth-based, WA-based non-executive director on Rio Tinto, and I think that's a good thing. Does the fact that you are Aboriginal change things? Well, I certainly know the Pilbara very well. I mean, that's some of my mob are from the Pilbara. It changes things in terms of it's a historical, interesting point, Patricia. For a long, long time, whether they be at the AICD or others, have called for more Aboriginal people or some Aboriginal people to be on the boards of large Australian companies. This is a historically interesting point because finally there is. And I dare say you'll start seeing more faces, and I'm pleased by that. I'm not going to reflect on my own place in history, but I think that it's a good thing to do. And I have noted with some, a bit perplexed, to be honest, Patricia, that some of the critique that I've had around going on boards have come from those demanding more Aboriginal faces. It is a slightly bizarre position to find myself in, I must admit. Yeah, OK. Well, let's interrogate that, because I think the reason is that you are obviously a treasurer in a government, and that, not that far after leaving that role, you've been able to have these board appointments on some very powerful boards. That's the issue. What are you saying, that, the fact that they want more Aboriginal people on, they should see this as a win? Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a win, and it will increase the pressure on other corporations to also bring Aboriginal people forward. Now, I have a particular skill set as well. There's no doubt about that, whether it's my legal background or finance background, whatever it happens to be. Now, me going on a board, whether it's now or 12 months from now, Patricia, I suspect would have copped the same critique. But I often put this to those critiquing. If I was gone on the board of an organisation that puts photovoltaic cells on roofs, I suspect I wouldn't have got a similar critique. I suspect there's a bias against miners in some of this critique that I'm receiving.
The PKKP is still negotiating with Rio over restitution, including restoration of the site and protection of artefacts. That's actually not complete. This story is not finished. What role will you play to ensure that this happens and traditional owners' wishes are actually listened to?
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, I'm still a non-executive director, and I'll be. My role is to ensure that the executives are doing this well. But your point is absolutely right. This is not complete, and I suspect won't be complete for some time. But in fact, it's probably an ongoing thing. Now, you don't set and forget anymore. You know, this is an ongoing relationship management issue, particularly around heritage matters and also those artefacts and others that have been collected over the years. This is now an opportunity, I think, and you see the state government over here now very much moving into the space of its own cultural centre. So I think there is a greater recognition of what is in heritage and what is in WA, but also how the corporate sector and the state government can do more to protect that.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia.
That's former WA Aboriginal Affairs Minister. He was also the Treasurer, Ben Wyatt. In fact, he was touted as a future Premier, but then he ended up leaving politics, and clearly now, today, that announcement that he will be on the Rio Tinto board later this year.